Explaining the Soviet-Japanese War. As the Qing dynasty in China continued to decline, two countries wished to expand into the resource-rich region of Manchuria. Those two countries were Japan and Russia. Japan had previously attacked China in the late 19th century and had gained control over Korea and Taiwan. Korea happened to border Manchuria, and the tensions caused by this would lead to the Russo-Japanese War in the early 20th century, which Japan would win and would take Port Arthur. Only a few years after, the Qing dynasty would collapse, and China would be divided amongst warlords, while Japan would be expanding its influence in the region by taking over German concessions after World War I. In Russia, in 1917, the Russian Revolution would put the communists into control in the country. This would spark a civil war within Russia, and Japan, joining many Western powers, would attempt to defeat the communists during this civil war. This would fail, however, and Russia would be able to expand its influence into the newly independent states of Tannu-Tuva and Mongolia. Meanwhile, Manchuria was stabilized by a warlord named Zhang Zuolin, who aligned himself with the Japanese and in the 1920s was even able to take Beijing. However, he would soon be forced out of the city by the Kuomintang led by Chiang Kai-shek. This would anger the growing Japanese militaristic factions, and so they would have him assassinated. Then, to keep the Kuomintang from invading Manchuria, the Japanese would set one of their own railway lines on fire, known as the Mukden Incident. Now, having a fake justification for invading Manchuria, the Japanese would invade Manchuria, taking it over, and then would set up a puppet state known as Manchukuo. Hundreds of border violations would then take place, most of them being Soviet espionage missions, however most of them would be peaceful. People within Japan began calling for an invasion of Russia to secure resources. In January of 1935, a small clash would take place where around 100 Mongolian cavalrymen would attack a Manchukuo patrol force. In June, a number of Soviet troops would attack a Japanese patrol. Small clashes like these would continue until 1938. Meanwhile, Japanese troops would capture the Chinese region of Inner Mongolia, turning it into a puppet state known as Mengjiang. Then, in 1937, after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, Japan would fully invade China, taking important cities such as Beijing, Nanjing, and Shanghai. Finally, in 1938, the Japanese intercepted Soviet messages telling their troops to occupy important areas around Lake Khasan. Because of this, the Japanese would attack. However, the Soviets would be quick to reinforce their positions, and after days of fighting, the Soviets would be able to hold their positions. Unable to break through without escalating the war, the Japanese would accept the border at the Tunmen River. However, the Japanese would still contest the Mongolian border, as both countries sent troops to disputed areas as skirmishes intensified. Then, in the summer of 1939, the Japanese Kwantung Army, acting without orders from Tokyo, would attack. They would bomb Soviet airfields and would send over 30,000 men to assault the Soviet positions. But the Soviets, who outnumbered the Japanese 2-1, were led by Gregory Zhukov. He would counterattack by bombarding the Japanese and then encircling them. This was also around the time that Stalin would sign a non-aggression pact with the No-No Mustache Man, meaning if Japan was to actually go to war with the Soviets, they would have no help. Also around this time, Japan's war in China would reach a stalemate. In September, after the No-No Mustache Man had invaded Poland and started World War II, a ceasefire would be signed. Their failure to invade north would cause the Japanese to look south for more resources. The following year, the Japanese would create the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere and would invade places like Burma and French Indochina. While this was going on, the No-No Mustache Man had just taken Paris. With both the Soviets and the Japanese occupied elsewhere, they would sign a neutrality pact in April of 1941. With the Soviets no longer being a threat to Japan, later that year, they would attack Pearl Harbor. Over the next few years, the No-No Germans and the Japanese would be pushed back, and in 1945, Stalin would accept to help the Allies on the Pacific Front against Japan. In May of 1945, the Germans would surrender, and even after the Potsdam Declaration calling for Japan's unconditional surrender, Japan would refuse. Because of this, on the 6th of August, 1945, an atomic bomb would be dropped onto Hiroshima. A couple days later, the Soviets would invade Manchuria with over 1 million men, attacking on 3 fronts. In just over a week, they would take over almost all of Manchuria, and would threaten to take over the Korean peninsula. So, the United States would sign a treaty with them, agreeing to divide Korea amongst the two. Just a day before the Soviets landed in northern Korea, the Japanese would surrender, bringing not only World War II, but the Soviet-Japanese War to an end. In conclusion, the Soviet-Japanese War was a short conflict that lasted from 1945 to 1945, near the end of World War II between the Soviet Union and Japan. This war would see Kim Il-sung being put into power in northern Korea controlled by the Communists, and Manchuria being given to Communist China, giving them a leg up over the Nationalists in the Chinese Civil War. It was a very short war, which could have been explained in 1 minute. However, it's important to explain the Soviet-Japanese border skirmishes which happened before World War II. Thank you for watching this video on the Soviet-Japanese War.